You'd think that this would be easy to spot. A man who experimented on children, another who sent trains full of people to die. It seems impossible to think that they could ever blend back into the crowd. After the war, the world was busy rebuilding, and in the noise, these monsters slipped through the cracks. Some shaved their heads, grew moustaches, and changed their names. Some didn't even bother. They just walked away. Take Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death. He tortured children in Auschwitz, dissected twins just to see what made them different. And after all of this, he walked out through Italy, then to a ship to Argentina. He lived on a farm, he went to parties, he sent letters to his family. Like nothing ever happened. And the strangest part is that the world helped them do it. Vatican priests forged travel papers, Red Cross officers issued fake IDs, Western intelligence agencies, the same ones that condemned Nazi crimes, recruited some of those men for their own Cold War games. For decades, they lived freely, while survivors struggled to make the world remember. Some were hunted down, others escaped entirely, and what emerges from these stories is a glimpse into a world that tolerated, enabled, and sometimes even protected these monstrous men. This is the story of the Nazis who escaped justice, the networks that carried them, and the hunters who refused to let the past stay buried. So when Nazi Germany surrendered in 1945, it felt like the world could finally breathe again. Hitler was gone, the camps were liberated, and it seemed as though justice would only be a matter of time. And since the Allies had the names of the criminals and the evidence of their crimes, there was supposed to be no way that these architects of genocide would just slip through the cracks. But a lot of them did. And that's what birthed this story. Because how do you lose men like Joseph Mengele or Adolf Eichmann? They were among the most recognizable faces of the Nazi regime, yet somehow they just vanished into thin air. Now, part of the answer lies in the chaos that came after the war. Europe in 1945 was unrecognizable. The cities were razed through, and it was hard to know where the border began and where it stopped. There were millions of people wandering about with nothing but scraps of paper saying who they were. Entire trains of refugees crossed borders daily. Soldiers dressed as civilians, and there were times civilians were mistaken for soldiers. And of course, the Nazis exploited that. They already knew that chaos would be the perfect cover, so they had plans even before the Third Reich collapsed. However, these monsters disguised as humans wouldn't have been able to pull off escape without help. And the most prevalent place to go if you wanted help to disappear and avoid the consequences of killing millions was an escape network that would later be named the ratlines. A fitting name if you think about it, since they were smuggling the worst kind of vermin out of Europe. It began, oddly enough, in churches. Inside certain monasteries and diocesan offices, priests and monks kept lists of people they believed were in danger of communist persecution. Some of these names belonged to former SS men, Gestapo officers, or concentration camp doctors. The Vatican's humanitarian branches, like the Pontifical Commission for Assistance, worked alongside the International Red Cross, distributing travel documents to displaced persons. In reality, though, it was almost impossible to check who anyone really was. A single sheet of paper stamped with a red cross and sealed with a Vatican approval was the means of identification in those times, and it was enough to make war criminals disappear. One of the Ratline's main routes ran through Italy, and men like Bishop Alwa Udal, an Austrian cleric stationed in Rome, helped hundreds of Nazis secure papers and safe passage. Udal believed they were good Christians who had fought bravely against Bolshevism. In his mind, he wasn't protecting killers, he was saving souls from communism. And among those souls was Franz Stangl, commandant of Treblinka, and Adolf Eichmann, the man who organized the Holocaust's logistics. They passed through Genoa or Rome, often staying at monasteries along the way, blending in with crowds of refugees. A fake name, a Red Cross passport, a ship ticket, and these Nazis could be on their way to Buenos Aires, Montevideo, or Santiago. If you're wondering how these were possible, the uncomfortable answer is that the world was already moving on. The Cold War had begun, and the moral lines were blurry. The same intelligence agencies that hunted Nazis were also recruiting them. The US brought over German scientists under Operation Paperclip. The same men who had built weapons for Hitler were now building rockets for NASA. Now, the Vatican, for its part, justified the ratlines as humanitarian aid. The Red Cross said it couldn't possibly vet everyone. Spain under Franco openly welcomed ex-Nazis as friends of the new Europe. And Argentina's dictator, Juan Perón, well, he didn't just look the other way. he opened the door. He believed these men could help modernize his country, bringing German efficiency to South America. Imagine suddenly becoming valuable and indispensable because your criminal record was exactly what the world was looking for. Pretty f***ed up, isn't it? Meanwhile, back in Europe, families of Holocaust victims were still digging through ruins, searching for graves that would never be found. It's easy, decades later, to imagine that justice failed because these men were clever. But the truth is, they were helped by priests, by bureaucrats, and by politicians who looked the other way. One journalist who investigated the ratlines described them as a mirror held up to the moral ruin of post-war Europe. They bred the idea that evil could be excused, repurposed, or simply forgotten, and by the time the dust settled, thousands of war criminals had vanished. We like to think that evil pays its price, that the bad guys are caught, the victims remembered, and that the world learns, but if the story of the Nazis who escaped tells us anything, it's that evil isn't always punished, at least not in the way we'd expect. Let's start with Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death. Of all the names that slipped through the cracks after the war, this one should send a shiver down your spine. Joseph Mengele. At Auschwitz, he was called Der Todesengel, the Angel of Death. He was a doctor with good looks and a surgeon's precision who greeted new arrivals on the ramp with a flick of his finger. Left or right, life or death. That was his first experiment. And it was this calm decisiveness that made him so terrifying. Survivors remembered his gloved hand pointing children one way while mothers were pointed in another direction. Sometimes he'd smile, almost gently as if reassuring them, and then send them straight to the gas chambers. But what truly etched his name into infamy were his experiments. Mengele had an obsession with twins. He believed they held the key to understanding hereditary, the Nazi fantasy of racial purity. He would measure them, weigh them, inject them with dyes, and perform surgeries without anesthesia. When one twin died, the other was killed too, so their bodies could be compared. It sounds like something out of a nightmare, but it happened daily. Under his supervision, children were reduced to test subjects, labeled by number and treated as necessary sacrifices for the advancement of science. When Auschwitz fell to the Red Army in January 1945, Mengele fled and left behind thousands of dead people with no remorse. He had escaped the camp days before liberation, blending into the tide of retreating SS officers. By the time Allied troops began rounding up the war criminals, he was already hidden in Bavaria, living under false names, pretending to be just another displaced German. The Americans captured him briefly, twice in fact, but let him go both times because they didn't realize who he was. He'd swapped his uniform for a soldier's coat, removed his SS blood group tattoo, and passed as a low-ranking medic. The chaos worked perfectly in his favor. By 1949, the net around him started to tighten. The Nuremberg trials had ended, new investigations were beginning, and the name Mengele had become shorthand for the worst kind of cruelty. So, using a Red Cross passport under the name of Helmut Gregor, he boarded a ship in Genoa bound for Argentina. On paper, he was a refugee escaping post-war Europe, and Argentina was more than happy to welcome him. Von Braun's government had already opened its doors to thousands of Nazis, including scientists, officers, and propagandists. To the Argentine elite, these men weren't war criminals, they were experts who could modernize the nation, and Mengele fit right in. He started small, working as a farmhand outside Buenos Aires, but he soon joined a circle of well-connected exiles from former SS officers to businessmen, and even the priests who had helped him escape. He later became part owner of a farm equipment company, living comfortably and occasionally returning to Germany under false names to visit family and conduct other business. It's almost insulting how easy it was for him. Meanwhile, survivors were testifying about him. They described his calm voice, his gloved hands, and his experiments on their siblings. They said his name in courtrooms, on record, in books. But in the Southern Hemisphere, Joseph Mengele was buying suits, going to dinner parties, and watching his son grow up. In the 1960s, when Mossad agents hunted down Adolf Eichmann, another fugitive Nazi hiding in Buenos Aires, Mengele panicked. He knew it might be his turn next, so he fled again, this time to Paraguay and then to Brazil. He changed names repeatedly, relying on Nazi sympathizers who sheltered him in small towns and rural farms. By the 70s, the Angel of Death was an old man. His health was failing. He no longer had his old friends as a shield, and he had long since stopped writing to his family under his real name. He wrote about the weather, his garden, his loneliness, but never about Auschwitz or the children he killed. Then one afternoon in 1979, while swimming off the coast of Brazil, Mengele suffered a stroke and drowned. Just like that, he was buried under yet another false name, Wolfgang Gerhard. For years, rumors persisted that he was still alive. Someone said he was in Paraguay. Others claimed to have seen him in Chile. It wasn't until 1985 that German authorities exhumed the grave, and after years of forensic testing, they confirmed that the bones were his. Justice in the formal sense, never arrived. He died free, the same man who once decided with a flick of his finger who lived and who died. We have to wonder what this says about civilization if a man like Mengele could walk among us for 3 decades, unrepentant, unpunished, and even protected by institutions that should have known better. Maybe this isn't about escape, maybe it's just about how fragile the justice system can be. Next up, Adolf Eichmann, the capture that changed history. Adolf Eichmann was not a mad scientist or a sadist in a white coat. He wasn't even charismatic. He was an office man, polite, organized, disturbingly ordinary. His job at the height of the Third Reich was to move human beings from their homes to the gas chambers. Strange, isn't it, that something as monstrous as the Holocaust could have a man like that at its center. He had no rage or ideology driving him. He was just a clerk with a pen whose ink was responsible for millions of deaths. When Germany collapsed in 1945, Eichmann slipped into the noise like so many others. He shaved his moustache, borrowed a new name, and vanished into the rubble of northern Germany. For years he drifted, working odd jobs, hiding on farms, pretending to be no one. And somehow it worked. By 1950, he had a Red Cross passport under the name Ricardo Clement. His destination was, of course, Argentina. And when he got there, he played by the books. Factory work, family, and a rented house in the suburbs. To anyone else, he was just another immigrant trying to rebuild. Then one day, that all changed. A German-Jewish exile in Buenos Aires, Lothar Hermann, had noticed something strange. His daughter's partner, Adolf's son, kept bragging that his father had been big in the war. Upon confirming that Adolf was indeed one of the escaped Nazis, Hermann sent a letter to Israel. It took years for Mossad to believe him, but when they finally did, they sent a team. One cold evening in May 1960, Eichmann stepped off a bus on Garibaldi Street, walking home from work. A car pulled up, men got out, silent and fast, and one of them whispered, "Momentito, senor," before pulling him inside. They kept him hidden for 9 days, drugged and disguised, before smuggling him onto an El Al flight to Jerusalem. His trial was broadcast to the world. Survivors testified in front of cameras for the first time. And there was Eichmann, with a calm and expressionless look, insisting he was merely following orders. That phrase became infamous. It was his entire defense, and perhaps his final delusion, the idea that obedience could wash away guilt. Of course, if his son was boasting that his father had been very important in the war, it hadn't been just a job to him. It had been a thing of pride, worthy of celebration behind closed doors, but hidden because the world no longer operated that way. He was sentenced to death by hanging in 1962, with his ashes scattered at sea. For once, justice did catch up. But the question remains, how could a man sit at a desk, tick off names headed for a gas chamber, and never see the faces behind them? Next up, Klaus Barbie, the butcher who became a spy. By the time Adolf Eichmann was hanged in Israel, another ghost from the same world was sitting comfortably in South America, drinking coffee, running a business, and occasionally advising the local military. His name wasn't Klaus Barbie anymore. It was Klaus Altmann, a harmless German expat, or so everybody thought. Barbie had once ruled the city of Lyon with terror. They called him the Butcher, and not metaphorically. He was responsible for the murder of over 4,000 people, took it upon himself to beat prisoners until he broke their bones, orchestrated mass deportations, and signed orders that sent Jewish children from an orphanage straight to Auschwitz. People remembered him by the sound of his boots on stairs and by the smell of fear that hung in his interrogation rooms. And yet when the war ended, the man responsible for some of the most intimate cruelties of the Nazi regime didn't face a firing squad. He got a job. When the war ended, France listed him as one of their most wanted war criminals, and you'd think that a man with a record like that would be hunted down, tried, and punished. But instead, there was a strange twist. In the early years of the Cold War, the Allies who had just defeated fascism became obsessed with stopping communism. And suddenly, men like Klaus Barbie, who were trained interrogators fluent in the methods of fear, became useful again. The US Army's Counterintelligence Corps, or CIC, found him in Germany in 1947. They knew exactly who he was. They also knew what he had done. But instead of arresting him, they decided to hire him. His experience in anti-communist operations was apparently more valuable than justice. He was useful. Useful is quite a word, isn't it? As if a man's efficiency at torture could be repurposed. For several years, Barbie worked for them, hunting supposed Soviet agents while his victims' families still searched for his face among the living. It's one of those historical moments that feels impossible to justify, yet it happened, and it was documented, signed, and buried under classified. By 1950, pressure grew. France was demanding his extradition, and the Americans didn't want a scandal, so they helped him disappear. Through the ratlines, Barbie was quietly smuggled out of Europe. The CIC arranged his passage to Italy, provided false papers under the name Klaus Altmann, and by 1951, he was on a ship to South America. He settled in Bolivia, a country that at the time welcomed men like him who were skilled, connected, and ideologically aligned. As Klaus Altmann, he became a businessman, an advisor, even a government consultant. His reputation for security expertise earned him influence in Bolivia's military regimes, and he worked with intelligence services, helped suppress dissent, and even dealt with drug traffickers and arms merchants. Decades after the war, the Butcher of Leon was still profiting from violence, just under a new name and a new flag. Barbie lived in Bolivia for more than 30 years, building a family, a fortune, and a network of political protection. Meanwhile, in France, he became the man who simply evaporated, like he didn't even exist. Journalists occasionally caught hints of him, but no one could bring him home. However, the tide turned in the 1970s when a German activist couple, Bette and Serge Klarsfeld, both children of Holocaust survivors, made it their personal mission to find Nazi fugitives. They tracked leads across continents and finally located Barbie in La Paz in Bolivia. When the Klarsfelds exposed Klaus Barbie's whereabouts in Bolivia, the scandal nearly toppled governments. Because Barbie hadn't just escaped justice, he'd been employed by it. But finding him was one thing, and getting him to justice was another. Bolivia refused to hand him over, and a man like Barbie, with way too many allies in possession of state secrets, was simply too powerful. It took over a decade of diplomatic pressure before a political shift in Bolivia finally broke his protection. In 1983, the new government extradited him to France. When he arrived, old men and women lined the streets, watching the monster of their youth return in handcuffs. The trial began in 1987. Survivors testified, some for the first time, recounting how their families vanished in his cells and how he had personally overseen torture sessions. Barbie sat there, old but defiant, refusing to apologize. He was convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life imprisonment. 4 years later, in 1991, he died in his cell, unrepentant to the end. But his death didn't even feel like closure. Rather, it was just a lesson that arrived too late. Franz Stangl, the commander who built death factories. By the time Klaus Barbie was advising generals in Bolivia, another fugitive had been living quietly across the Atlantic. His name was Franz Stangl, and while Barbie had tortured for intelligence, Stangl had engineered death itself. He started as a policeman in Austria, methodical, soft-spoken, neatly dressed, the kind of office work bureaucracies just love. When the Nazis annexed Austria, Stangl rose through the ranks of the euthanasia program, where he learned how to process human lives with speed and silence. Those skills would later define him at Sobibor and Treblinka, two of the deadliest extermination camps in occupied Poland. Under his command, over 900,000 people were killed, mostly Jews who were herded off trains, stripped, and gassed within hours of arrival. The camps ran like assembly lines, and Stangl took pride in their order. To him, it wasn't murder. It was management. He was nicknamed White Death because he would wear a white uniform and carry a whip, perhaps to reinforce that he was only keeping the order and nothing else. When the war ended, chaos gave him cover. Like so many others, Stangl blended into the refugee flow, first hiding in Austria and then slipping into Italy. The Catholic Church's ratlines provided him with false papers, and by 1948 he was in Syria. A few years later, he was in Brazil, a land that promised anonymity to anyone who could pay for it. There, Stangl built a quiet life. He worked as a mechanic at a Volkswagen factory, blending in among the thousands of European immigrants who had washed ashore after the war. He raised a family, went to church, and sent his daughters to school. His neighbors thought he was kind, disciplined, maybe a little private. None of them knew they were living beside a man responsible for the most efficient killing centers in human history. But there were people who still remembered. By the 1960s, Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal were tracking bank records, church documents, and rumors that surfaced in immigrant cafes. Wiesenthal found Stangl's name in an old file, cross-referenced it with whispers from Europe's displaced communities, and followed that trail to Brazil. In 1967, after almost 2 decades of freedom, Stangl was arrested in Sao Paulo and extradited to West Germany. His trial drew far less attention than Eichmann's in Jerusalem, but it reveals something about how ordinary men could rationalize genocide by saying it was their duty. When he was asked how he could oversee the deaths of hundreds of thousands, he said that he had a job to do, and he did it. He was following orders, so his conscience was clear. In prison interviews with journalist Gita Serani, he spoke almost gently, describing Treblinka as if it were a logistical problem rather than a moral one. He said he'd never personally killed anyone, since he had only kept the system running. Serani pressed him until at last he conceded one sentence that revealed everything. "My guilt," he said, "is that I'm still here." He admitted that He had known it was wrong, but that he had convinced himself it was necessary. He even confessed to once dreaming that the corpses of his victims were chasing him through the forest, and yet, when pressed, he still said he never saw himself as a murderer. He died of heart failure a few hours after his final recorded confession in 1971. No funeral, no monument, just another life that ended quietly, as if erasure could balance the scale. Aribert Heim, the doctor who vanished. The doctor who became a ghost. At Mauthausen concentration camp, Heim's victims called him Dr. Death. He arrived there in 1941, young, brilliant, and utterly obedient to the ideology that shaped him. Unlike the men at the gates or the officers barking orders, Heim wore a white coat, and instead of using his syringes and scalpels to heal and care, he used them to kill. He would perform surgeries without anesthesia, amputate limbs off living people with no medical problems, just to research, and inject petrochemicals or even air directly into his victims' hearts. Then he'd time how long the heart took to stop beating. He kept meticulous notes because to him it was how he practiced medicine and how he satisfied his curiosity. But of course, what it really was just sadism dressed as science. When the war ended, Heim was briefly held by US forces, but in the chaos of post-war Europe, the confusion, the shifting camps, the endless paperwork, he just slipped away. The Americans didn't realize they'd released a man who'd murdered hundreds with his own hands. In the years that followed, the trail went cold. He practiced medicine in Baden-Baden for a while, quietly under his real name. Patients had no idea who he was. It wasn't until the 1960s, when prosecutors started reopening Nazi-era cases, that Heim suddenly disappeared again, this time for good. He left behind his house, his bank accounts, his family. Investigators found his car abandoned near the German-Swiss border. From there, he became smoke. At first, the leads pointed towards South America. After all, that's where Mengele had gone. It made sense. Argentina, Chile, Brazil. These were the safe havens, the lands of new beginnings for men with old sins. But none of the trails held up. Heim wasn't in Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo. He wasn't hiding in the Andes or living under an alias in Paraguay. He was somewhere else entirely. Decades later, journalists from Der Spiegel and other publications would piece together the story. Heim had fled to Egypt, arriving sometime in the early 1960s under the name Tariq Hussein Farid. He'd converted to Islam, learned Arabic, and started over as a doctor in Cairo. The irony is almost unbearable. The man who once tortured people in the name of medicine was now living in the Arab world, praying in mosques and treating the sick. He rented a modest room near Al-Azhar Mosque, a small sun-bleached apartment with thin curtains and a desk covered in medical books. To his neighbors, he was quite a foreigner with kind manners. He prayed 5 times a day. He treated patients who couldn't afford hospital care. Some said he even refused payment, living off savings wired from Europe, and none of them had an inkling of who he really was. Back in Germany, prosecutors still searched for him, and Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal refused to let the trail go cold. They said Heim had to be alive. He'd been spotted in Uruguay, then Spain, then Chile again. The rumors came and went like waves. But years passed, and no one found him. Heim's son, Rudiger, claimed he didn't know where his father was. Later it emerged that wasn't entirely true. He'd visited Cairo more than once, sent money, and even kept correspondence. When he died in 1992 of cancer, it was a quiet death, and he was buried in a Muslim cemetery in Cairo. It wasn't until 2009, 17 years later, that the truth finally surfaced. Reporters from ZDF and Der Spiegel tracked down Heim's family and uncovered his belongings from his small Cairo apartment. Inside were medical documents in Arabic, personal letters, and photographs, all tying Tariq Hussein Farid to the real Aribert Heim. The handwriting matched perfectly. It turned out that the ghost had been dead all along. While survivors of Mauthausen had to live with the horrors they had endured, the man responsible had spent his final years in prayer and peace halfway across the world. And that's the most haunting part. Mengele never got to face judgment, and by the time investigators even confirmed his death, it was already too late for justice. So if evil can vanish, then someone has to make sure it's found again. And to end this video without mentioning the people who did all they could to bring justice in a world where skill, money, or baseless compassion could set monsters free, would be to ignore a light that kept pushing to be seen in the midst of overwhelming darkness. It begins with Simon Wiesenthal. He had survived Mauthausen, the camp where Aribert Heim played God with his scalpel, and when liberation finally came, Wiesenthal was little more than a skeleton who could still take notes. And he did. He wrote down names. Every guard he could remember, every officer who had sneered as the bodies piled up. He wasn't a spy, not even a detective, just an architect with a typewriter, and a terrifying sense of duty. He said he wanted to build a bridge from the dead to the living. It's a poetic thing to say until you realize that what it meant was doing everything and giving up any semblance of a normal life to ensure that the murdered were remembered by name and the murderers punished by law. And then there was Beat and Serge Klarsfeld, a German woman and a French Jew, an unlikely pair who met in Paris on a subway and decided that silence wasn't an option. Beat's father had served in Hitler's army. Serge's father had been deported to Auschwitz. And while the rest of Europe tried to forget, the Klarsfelds would not keep quiet. They published the names of Nazis living openly under new identities. They crashed political events, chained themselves to fences, and threw leaflets at ministers. When West Germany's chancellor turned out to be a former Nazi, Beat walked up to him in front of the cameras and slapped him across the face. She was arrested, of course, but the world noticed. You'd think that such people were driven by revenge. But they weren't. What drove them was disbelief that so many killers could go home, marry, raise children, and attend Sunday Mass like nothing happened. That the world's appetite for comfort could so easily overpower its memory. Because indifference is quieter than evil, but it's just as dangerous. While it might not kill or maim, it forgets, and it allows evil to continue. Thank you for watching.